This video is going to focus on tissue features. So when we look at different tissues and different cells within the tissue, some of the features that we may see, and this is also going to explain how the tissues are functioning in the way that they are. Now, I will say I think that this set of notes goes into a little too much detail about some things, so you will notice me skipping, and that's because they're going to come up later, especially in the integumentary system, and so we can save it for there. We've got plenty to memorize in this chapter, so we don't need to make it more complicated than it needs to be. So intracellular junctions are when two cells are next to each other in kind of that space where they meet. We're going to look at three different types. A tight junction is where adjacent cells are bound together by fusion of their plasma membranes. So we know that the cell membrane is two layers of lipids, and when the outer layer of lipids of two cells are kind of fused together, that's called a tight junction. It seals off that intercellular space, and it makes it impossible or difficult for substances to move in between cells. And that's just showing you the three different types that we're going to look at, and the tight junction is on the top. Okay, the second type are called desmosomes, and it's a patch that holds the cells together. The analogy is like a clothing snap, and it helps to keep cells from pulling apart, especially when they're under mechanical stress. And so there's proteins that kind of hook, and they come from the cytoskeleton, and they link the membranes together. And then the third type are called gap junctions, and gap junctions do allow communication, so sometimes they're called communicating junctions. And they have a ring-like structure called a connexin, and there's 6 proteins arranged kind of in a circle, like segments on an orange. And this is how larger molecules or ions, glucose, amino acids move from one cell into the next cell. Okay, we're going to do an overview of glands, but again, here's where I think this gets into a little bit more detail than we need in this chapter. But a gland could be a cell or organ. Normally we would want to think about it like an organ, but it can be a cell that secretes substances for use somewhere else in the body, or for substances that need to be eliminated from the body. They are composed of epithelial tissue, but usually have a connective tissue framework and a capsule. There are 2 types of glands, exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine connect to the body surface by a duct, which is an epithelial tissue-lined tube, and then that is what brings the secretion to the surface. So some examples are sweat, mammary glands, or tear glands. And then the other type is endocrine glands. They have no ducts, but they secrete hormones, and they secrete them directly into the bloodstream. So examples are the thyroid gland, adrenal glands, or the pituitary gland. Some organs have both endocrine and exocrine functions, namely the liver, gonads, and the pancreas. And then there are some unicellular glands. So glands that are only one cell in size, and they are found in the epithelium, and that is predominantly non-secreting. But they could be endocrine or exocrine. So an example here would be those goblet cells that we saw in the tissue sample, those wine glass looking cells, and they are secreting mucus. Okay, and here's where I think we're going into a lot more detail than is needed at this time. So I'm going to flip through a little bit. We can categorize them into different categories, but I think we're just going to stick with, as we go through, looking at them individually and seeing their function. But here are the types of glands and secretions that we will come in contact with as we keep going through each system. Serous glands produce thin, watery secretions. Examples would be perspiration or milk, tears, and digestive juices. We will see this in the next chapter. And mucus glands are the other big category. They produce a glycoprotein, mucin, that absorbs water to make a sticky secretion called mucus. Goblet cells are an example of cells secreting mucus. And then mixed glands have both cell types, and so they are able to secrete mucus and serous. And then cytogenic glands release whole cells. The examples would be testes and ovary that are able to release sperm and egg cells. Okay, when we look at secreting glands, we have two types, merocrine, or they're also called eccrine glands. They have vesicles that secrete their secretion or release their secretion by exocytosis. And we'll see these in the tear glands, the pancreas, gastric glands. And then the apocrine glands are primarily merocrine mode of secretion. So these are called, or examples would be auxiliary sweat glands and your mammary glands. So they have little vesicles that they're excreting by exocytosis. And then another type is holocrine glands, where the cell accumulates the product and then the entire cell disintegrates. So some examples are your oil glands, glands in your eyelids. I'm going to fast forward here. I think we're going to get to all of this in the next chapter when we get to skin. But before we get to skin, we should mention here about membranes. Membranes line our cavities of our body and cover the viscera. There are a few different types. Cutaneous membrane is the skin. That's our largest membrane of the body, and it is made of stratified squamous epithelium. And that is the epidermis layer, and then underneath that, the dermis layer is the connective tissue. Now we'll get into this more detail next chapter, but the cutaneous membrane is often called a dry membrane because it doesn't secrete things really, and it is serving as a protective function. Whereas mucous membranes are sometimes called mucosa, and they line our passageways that are open to the external environment. So if you think about the passageways coming in from our nose, our mouth, and every other opening that we have, those are lined with mucous membranes. Serosum membranes are internal membranes, and they are made of simple squamous epithelium over areolar tissue, and that produces serous fluid. And this covers our organs, lines the walls of the body cavities, and we see it throughout the body. And then a synovial membrane, we're going to see when we study joints. They line the joint cavities and secrete a synovial fluid, which we need in our joints to cushion. So here's another picture of simple squamous epithelium, one single layer of flattened cells. And then here's a close-up of what a mucous membrane would look like in the different layers. Now we will get to this a little bit more as we get through each system. We'll see this again, but it's just showing you how the two different tissue types are layered, and this is what's lining all of our passages that open to the outside.